Do you have autism? Was your mom taking Tylenol while she was pregnant with you? You may be entitled to compensation. Or so these ads that I keep seeing keep saying. If you're like me, you've likely seen these ads which claim that Tylenol, which is also called paracetamol or acetaminophen, is linked with a 20% increase of likelihood of autism and an increased likelihood of ADHD. Just looking at the Justice Advocates website, it does appear that the study's sample size was pretty large. Now, this Justice Advocates website was one of the many people who were advertising that if you are autistic or ADHD and your mom took Tylenol while she was pregnant with you, you would possibly be entitled to compensation. Let's first look at the article that started this whole thing. Prenatal exposure to acetaminophen and risk for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autistic spectrum disorder. A systematic review, meta-analysis, and meta-regression analysis of cohort studies is the title of the paper, which is obnoxiously long, which I swear all of these science papers really love to be. Regardless of the length of the title, it does appear to be a pretty legit source. After all, meta-analyses is one of the highest forms of evidence that we should look at because it looks at multiple studies and looks at all the data between those and can kind of give us a bigger consensus of what the field has been looking at on a particular topic. As in any systematic review, they go over all of the inclusion criteria and all that jazz, narrowing it down to 7 cohort studies and putting a heavier importance on 3 of those studies due to having larger sample sizes. As part of their results, they note that 6 of the studies reported ADHD diagnosis and 5 reported ASD diagnosis and emotional problems, and in the discussion share that their results indicate acetaminophen or Tylenol exposure during pregnancy is associated with a 20 to 30% increased risk for neurodevelopmental disorders, although I believe specifically ASD and ADHD were the focus of most of these studies. There's a very important line that immediately follows this that reads, however, results should be interpreted with caution because there was evidence of heterogeneity between study estimates of the outcomes. And then it includes some other things that could affect the results, including the studies that they looked at were all considered observational, and that makes them especially susceptible to something called confounding by indication, as well as some other biases listed. Confounding by indication basically is assuming that something happened because of exposure to this thing without considering something else that could have indicated exposure to this thing. So if you're lost like I was at first, let me give you an example. Why would someone want to take Tylenol? Well, someone might take Tylenol because they have a fever, because it's a fever reducer. So the fever could have indicated the exposure to Tylenol. So in this case, the confounding factor is the reason that they are seeing a higher amount of developmental disabilities in these cases due to the fact that they took the Tylenol, or is it due to reasons that makes someone take Tylenol that are actually the root causes? So this is the susceptibility, are we confounding by indication? And they do explain this themselves in the paper. Importantly, confounding by indication may distort the observed association when assessing associations between prenatal exposures and future illnesses in the offspring. Women with comorbidities and fever likely use acetaminophen more frequently than healthy pregnant women. Also, individuals using one medication are more likely to use other medications for indications other than fever and pain. These concomitant exposures may themselves increase the risk for neurodevelopmental adverse effects and contribute to confounding by indication. It has been reported that maternal infection and fever of different sources are associated with pregnancy adverse outcomes. Another thing to consider is what they called the heterogeneity of the study estimates of the outcomes. Big fancy words too, from my understanding, basically say that these different research papers used maybe different tests or different ways of measuring their data than each other, so the data might look a bit different because it's kind of hard to compile them using one scale or one measure. They also mentioned that the results could suffer from recall and interview bias, as the included studies used personal interviews as their method of information collection, and that exposure to acetaminophen as a single ingredient has not been reported to increase risk for birth defects in any trimester. It's important to note that all studies have limitations. So this is really just kind of a place on pretty much every research paper where it says the limitations and strengths of this research, because Not every paper can possibly consider every little factor. They go over all of this information. Anything that could have skewed their data, they put into this list. So it's not just this paper. Any paper that I've ever shown you has limitations. These limitations are included and noted to help you to interpret the information that you're seeing. However, this particular study, in my personal opinion, does have a pretty big list of limitations, as well as the very repeated use of interpret with caution. Because of how much they themselves emphasized caution when interpreting these results and the inability to account for confounding factors, I think that looking at research that could address confounding factors better would better serve us before we come to this dramatic conclusion. And of course, when someone's looking for some money, I kind of doubt they're going to be looking at things with caution when they can kind of find a way to get what they want. However, to be fair, as this case has progressed, it does look like there actually might be a little bit more to this than this one particular research paper. However, from my understanding, this is what set everything off. And by set everything off, there's also something that I think is kind of funny that you can do in the science, academia, whatever community, and that is either write rebuttal papers or like send in letters to the editor. And people did. So they basically kind of had like a little bit of a published argument about this paper. So this first one we're going to look at is actually a published letter to the editor. Their main beef was with the particular meta regression style of thing that they used to look at this data, which I'm not super good at right now. And maybe one day through like 5 million years of college, I'll finally understand this bit a little bit better. But there was a part that really interested me. I find it inconsequential to, one, list a seemingly insurmountable obstacle of limitations, not least assessment of the primary outcome parameter of interest that mitigate the findings of the underlying studies. 2, state appropriate substantial reservations with respect to interpretations of study findings and call for more research on the validity of the principal outcome parameters. And 3, yet perform a meta-analysis that forces these fundamentally incomparable data down the same rabbit hole. I believe the meta-analysis approach is inappropriate given the data at hand, and the application thereof is more likely to have produced potential harmful statistical noise rather than to have contributed a meaningful elucidation of the scientific questions posed. All those fancy words to basically say that they felt that the method that they used to compile the data was inappropriate and kind of forced things together to say something that it might not really be saying. This resulted in a response by 4 of the authors of the original paper. Essentially, they disagree, state why, and they also say the following. We share Damkir's skepticism of the association between prenatal exposure to acetaminophen and neurodevelopmental outcomes, as well as his clinical concerns. However, we do not believe this justifies avoiding the full analysis of the mounting evidence regarding this association. I find this kind of important because the people themselves who went through all of this data are also skeptical of the outcome that they basically implied in their research paper. I agree that there should be more research and we should report on the things that we're finding scientifically. I just find it a bit odd that the people who were doing this also were hesitant and had so many limitations and also felt that those limitations were a great number, yet still published it in such a way that would suggest what it suggests. And perhaps such is the process of research. Later, there was a paper that was submitted that framed itself more about disillusionment of an epidemiology model rather than an actual response to the study, yet was essentially a response to the study. Something interesting they said here was this. Marsawa et al. Reported a 20 to 30% higher risk of ADHD and ASD following prenatal acetaminophen exposure. Surprisingly, most of the original studies did not report diagnoses of ADHD or ASD. As a result, their summary estimates of risk are not informative about children's likelihood of ADHD and ASD diagnoses. So this may explain why Marsawa et al., basically the people who published that first research paper, had mentioned that certain studies were were weighted more than others. Since it appears that a lot of these studies did not specifically mention ADHD or ASD, which is kind of important to consider. This paper goes on to say that the widely differing effects being measured amongst the studies that were included makes the information essentially irrelevant to anything in the real world. Then goes on to explain the things that we would need to see to be able to see if it is Tylenol itself or that confounding by indication, something else indicating the use of Tylenol is actually the cause of these sorts of outcomes that we're seeing. Given, of course, those experiments would be ethical. They outline a risk percentage difference of 2.2% and 3% between children exposed to Tylenol and those not before birth, found to be possible in one study, which they find to be, quote, relatively small in magnitude, as do I. They then go into how only one of the studies included actually met the inclusion criteria set by the author themselves when it came to being able to look at the likelihood of an ASD diagnosis. They expressed concern because it is possible that there is a slight increase, but this could also be just due to confounding factors and there might not be an increase at all. This is especially concerning when the type of research this is has more weight and the fact that this article has been shared with so many news outlets. Before I get into the original author's response to this paper, there's actually another paper that expresses their thoughts on the disillusionment of the epidemiology model that they're looking at. So again, kind of a new part to add to this random, maybe not so random, but kind of amusing just because it's official argument. Basically, they were mad that they called it what they called it because really it was about the original paper with some random bumper information about how they were disillusioned with the model that they were talking about. They essentially say that the title is misrepresenting the contents of the paper and they want it amended. So then the people who wrote the disillusionment paper, that was essentially a critique of the article this video is concerned with, basically said, we actually did bring it to the overall concept and maybe we were provocative with our title, but no, we're not changing it. Anyway, back to the original author's response to these critiques. They start off with the typical courtesy comment where they agree with some of what was said, but they want to address some points. They took issue with the idea that their data has no real-world use and say that even though the effects detected were modest, they should still be paid attention to. Then they note that they were very clear about limitations and issues that could affect the results they were getting, and that it had been clearly communicated with the media as well. Basically, it's not their fault that the media took it and ran with it. They acknowledge that while their data might not be able to represent the precise effect of the intervention, it does represent the data that is currently available, which indicates, quote, a small increase in neurodevelopmental outcomes, end quote. They also note that 4 additional studies indicating a significant association between acetaminophen use during pregnancy and an increased risk of ADHD have been published following the publication of our meta-analysis. Then they reiterate again that it should be interpreted with caution, but also that it shouldn't be ignored. I'd like to pause here and address their annotations marked 5 through 8, which were basically them citing the 4 studies that had been published after their paper. I'm kind of perturbed by the fact that they said that these 4 were published following the publishing of their paper, considering one of them was published before their paper and was actually cited in that original paper. This 2017 study found long-term acetaminophen use during pregnancy to be related to more than a 2-fold increase in risk for ADHD in offspring. However, using acetaminophen for less than 8 days was actually negatively associated with the child having ADHD, meaning for some reason, if someone took Tylenol for less than 8 days, they were less likely to have a child with ADHD. Weirdly enough, fathers using acetaminophen was also associated with ADHD, while it had no effect if mothers did before pregnancy. So they make it clear that the causal role of acetaminophen in ADHD can be questioned, and they do not provide any definitive evidence for or against a causal relationship when it comes to pregnant mothers using Tylenol and their children having ADHD. The next paper is one from 2018 that looks at a birth cohort in Brazil. They found that there was an association with the use of acetaminophen while pregnant and emotional and hyperactivity symptoms in their child at 6 years old, and following up with them at 11 years old, a suggestive association. Additionally, the study found no association in girls at either age. They did have concerns because the data was gathered by asking mothers if they had taken medications when they were pregnant, so they had to rely on memory after the fact and self-report, including use or non-use of other things. And this was something that they had reported being a limitation in the main overall study that we first were looking at, right? Where observation, or basically also self-report, isn't necessarily 100% reliable. If you ask someone, hey, do you remember if you took Tylenol while you were pregnant? Some of them may clearly remember. They might even know how much they took. Other people may have no idea. And as they kind of mentioned in this study, you also have to rely on them whether they're going to tell you if they took other things or not. And that could be as simple as things that maybe they know they shouldn't take, or things that they forgot, to maybe not great things as well. The third paper on this list is one done by at least one author who seems to be involved in looking at this possible link a lot, and is a paper that focuses on the use of a particular model to try to reduce the effect of confounding bias when it comes to observational data, and uses said model to look at data from a health study to find that use of acetaminophen may influence neurodevelopment, not coming out with drastic percentages like our original study, and acknowledging limitations that they did take quite reasonable steps in addressing. Interestingly, unlike the Brazil study, there was no noted difference between girls and boys. The final paper mentioned made me laugh the moment that I read the abstract, which is kind of like an overall summary of what's going on with this paper. It literally talks about fevers that mothers experience during pregnancy and the increase of risk of ADHD, especially inattentive type. And it goes to say that the results did not change whether or not they used Tylenol. So I'm not really sure why they wanted to point that one out as being supportive to their cause. And maybe they ran a quick search so that they could put that in there, but it is kind of awkward when one of them doesn't even support what you're saying and another one wasn't after your publication and was in fact part of the citations that you used in said original paper. Another thing to note is that all of these were addressing ADHD and not autism. Now, going back to the rest of their response to being critiqued, they basically end by saying that they had emphasized that due to limitations, they couldn't really make a causal link, and that they did indeed get a bit fast and loose with the inclusion of what might be counted under ASD or ADHD, but wanted to encompass a broader aspect rather than just a strict definition. But I think we should probably be careful to adhere to that strict definition when we're making claims like this, especially when we consider the scientific process. We want to reduce as many variables as possible, which is what can make additional limitations to papers, right? Like, okay, well, we didn't take into consideration these things because it would have added another variable, and we're trying to at least narrow down research and data information to this thing. So when you say, okay, let's look at all these papers, well, some of them are actually saying actual diagnoses of ADHD or autism, and some of them are saying some symptoms that we think are related. That's a problem. We can't say that, oh, ASD is definitely related in this way, or an increase of it related to this, when you can't even make sure that the papers included involve actual ASD or ADHD diagnoses. Then the people who did the initial study that everyone was talking about reanalyzed and adjusted for more confounding factors, and concluded that their ability to draw a causal link between the use of acetaminophen and child ADHD is limited. And according to one article's perspective, after adjusting for these, the increased risk for ADHD nearly disappeared. Now, I found a website that was related to all of these ads and this whole lawsuit information that were pretty much primarily addressing overall, when we kind of zoom out of why we even were talking about this. These people said, hey, we're going to be suing Tylenol and suing all these people for not saying that it could cause ADHD or autism if you take this while you're pregnant. So yes, we just looked at kind of a lot of this data, but it was specifically because there's all these ads on my feed telling me and suggesting that ADHD and autism are caused by Tylenol use while pregnant. So I went ahead and looked for the pages that were making these claims, and I found this website that was kind of going over these things, and they include a lot of studies to support their claims, most of which we've already looked at so far in this video. There was another one, though, that I thought was interesting and more than fair to look at. This study looked at the levels of acetaminophen and its breakdown in the collected umbilical cord plasma of children in a large sample of people. This method helped clear the issue of maternal reporting regarding Tylenol use and showed an association between higher amounts of acetaminophen exposure and increased likelihood of diagnoses such as ADHD, ASD, and other developmental disabilities. Now, keep in mind, we already have seen in these papers that having more Tylenol use tends to be somehow associated with an increased risk. However, we had the argument of, well, is this because they're having fever and pain that they're using Tylenol so much? Is that confounding factor or this confounding by indication occurring? But this paper claims to have adjusted for more of these confounding biases, including maternal fever. And they're saying that the risk does appear to increase with the amount that they found, or basically the amount of Tylenol that the mothers took. And they do find themselves limited due to other confounding factors such as genetics or environmental influences that may not have been factored into this. Now remember that this is an association, not necessarily a confirmed causal link, but it is one of the more convincing studies on this topic. Now, a flaw in this study is pointed out in plain language in an article that was going over the publication of this paper, noting that the umbilical cord plasma study would imply that a single dose right before being born could somehow dramatically affect a child's brain, something most find unlikely since acetaminophen only stays in the blood for a few hours. So to avoid the problem of observational data, that meaning we had to just go off of what the mother said, they tried to use the umbilical cord plasma, right, to see how much was in the blood. But the problem is that Tylenol doesn't stay in the blood that long. So if we're just measuring by how much is in the plasma, that could say, okay, so this mom took like a ton of Tylenol right before she gave birth, so there'd be a ton of Tylenol in that plasma. Does that mean that somehow this child will now have differences or problems in brain development? And that doesn't seem very likely, right? The article also noted another study that examined the baby's first bowel movement, but that study also fell short in once again not considering why the mothers were taking Tylenol, hence the confounding by indication issue again. Now, this article that I'm looking at also is more helpful in bringing to light more about the situation than maybe the website that I was looking at, giving the lawsuit timeline, because the lawsuit timeline website shares that there were 91 professionals who signed a consensus statement calling for precaution around Tylenol based on the data that we've been looking at. Our article also mentions that there have been 3 published rebuttals against using this data to make such big, cautious claims or trying to, have lawsuits. And these rebuttals that they reference may or may not be the ones that we've already talked about, and I'm pretty sure they are. So if you follow my channel, you may know that it has been literally forever since I have posted, and quite a few months ago, I had actually put a poll out asking what you'd like to see from me, and this video was highly voted on. So I've actually been working on this video since that time, off and on. What works out for us on this particular situation is that by this delay, I was also able to look at an October 2023 study that kind of opens more thought on this whole situation. This study is able to look at the effects of Tylenol on stem cells that are becoming brain cells. And they look at the differences in gene expression that might be caused. To be honest, this article was really difficult for me to read just because of the high level of jargon that you just need to know to be able to navigate it. If you're really good at things like genetics, studying sciencey things, alleles, and all that fun stuff, this actually has like an interactive thing you can do if you understand what you're doing to kind of see what different things will do to express or not express different things. It's pretty cool, and I think the people that published it also think it's really cool. Like, fair enough, right? If you put all that data out there so people can do that, that's really cool. I just don't have that skill set. So basically, this study looked at those stem cells and basically the effect that different doses of Tylenol had on cell replication and maturation. And they found that this was highly dose dependent. Now, as really interesting and kind of cool about this research paper is, it does have the limitation and drawback of being in vitro. And so it can't take into consideration any of the other human processes that happen Because technically we consume the Tylenol. What does the metabolization look like? We're not directly affecting stem cells with Tylenol. We're not like dropping it right onto a stem cell, for example. So is there processes in the body, the actual human living body, that might make these kind of effects not actually occur, or maybe occur differently, or maybe in a less exaggerated way? Those sorts of things are the limitation that we are seeing with this study. They did mention that many of the genes were marked as potentially related to ADHD, and specifically mentioned one that was related to autism. Again, I would like to emphasize that, as this is really cool, very interesting stuff, especially about allele expression and just kind of the genetic side of things, especially because we have a lot of questions regarding the expression of ADHD and ASD when it comes to the genetic side of things and the phenotype. This is still not 100% capable of really looking into the whole process, again, because we're not seeing it in the actual environment in which it takes place. Having said all of that, I would say that this is probably the most compelling study that could suggest that paracetamol, acetaminophen, Tylenol, whatever you call it by, may play a causal role in impaired neurodevelopment. While I do find it very curious that there are these studies that are finding these types of associations, I do think it's important to remember that there are also many studies that show no correlation, show pretty much negligible to nothing for this correlation that we're finding being shown in these other studies. So this may just be how research works. For example, in the autism world, if you follow my channel, you probably have heard a lot of different studies that maybe have different viewpoints or come up with almost contrasting information. And most of the time we say, okay, well, autism is very heterogeneous, meaning it shows up very differently for each person. But when we look at this kind of research that we're talking about causal links to neurodevelopment, I thought maybe we should see something a bit more unified, but I could be wrong. Maybe all research is like this, where we have a lot of things saying no, a lot of things saying yes. So I do think this is a place that we should pay more attention to. But of course, all of these studies thus far have not been able to really get rid of these confounding factors, these limitations. We haven't been able to really ethically either, which is another issue with science, right? Look at, what does Tylenol do? We know for 100% sure like how much someone took, and all these other factors are controlled, and what it looks like in an actual human. We haven't really been able to do that with a study. Another very important question regarding this matter is, say that paracetamol, acetaminophen, Tylenol, whatever, is linked to a slight increase in chance of having ADHD or autism. Tylenol is currently pretty much the only thing that mothers can safely take while they're pregnant for pain relief. What are these expecting mothers supposed to do now if we say, actually, Tylenol is also something you shouldn't use while you're pregnant? We have more data suggesting that fevers themselves can be a problem. So do we let these mothers ignore their fevers and have these high fevers because they're afraid of taking Tylenol because they have a slight increased chance of having a child with ADHD or autism? Or is it simply due diligence to add a warning that it's possible that there's a slight increase of a chance that taking Tylenol while you're pregnant could result in a child with ADHD or autism? So apparently the FDA actually got involved a while ago, and then they just closed it because of insufficient evidence. However, they may get re-involved with a toxicology report of some kind if they get the funding approved in 2024. One of the judges who were involved in this case actually asked the FDA to weigh in, and they essentially just declined and then sent them their current data that they have already. This article mentions that there is another researcher who plans on doing a study with a larger sample size. So it does appear that we are going to be getting the research that we agree needs to happen. So if you want to jump on the train and get some money because you were born autistic or ADHD, you go for it, I guess. I don't know. I don't know how legit it is, but sure, do you if you want. I don't know if the window is still open because I have seen a waning in the amount of ads for this, probably especially because they are getting close to actually getting into court and doing what they need to do. And I think at some point, the amount of people who can be included in a class action lawsuit probably closes. I don't really know much about the law, so that's really not my area. So I don't even know if you can jump on the train now if you wanted some money. I don't think you'd get much since there's probably a lot of people, but who knows? You never know. I hope that you all are having a wonderful week, day, year, month, however long it's been since you've last seen me, and however long it will be till you see me next. I so appreciate you all. I appreciate everyone who supported me through any means throughout the past, and currently I have closed down my Patreon just because I can't really keep up with it. I feel bad. I don't want to just have people who are donating with perks and then those perks not happening, right? And also these videos. The point is for me to be able to do more videos. So my Patreon is closed right now, but I do have my Ko-fi open if you do want to give like a one-time thing. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!